They told you paper was a European miracle, a clean invention, a white moment of genius. Like Europe woke up one day, dipped a feather in ink, and the world suddenly learned how to remember. That's the story you were sold. But here's the contrast they never want you to sit with. Before Europe could write its own name, Africa was already recording law, science, trade, prayer, and memory, not on caves, not on guesses, on engineered writing surfaces designed to last. And once you see that, the whole timeline collapses. Because paper doesn't create civilization. Civilization demands paper. Think about that. You don't invent writing material unless you already have something worth preserving. Laws, math, medicine, property, power. Africa had all of it, long before Europe, and the reason you were taught otherwise isn't ignorance, it's strategy. See, Europe loves to start the story at Greece. That's the trick. Start late, inherit early, erase the middle. But when you rewind past Greece, past Rome, past the Renaissance fairy tale, you land in Africa, specifically the Nile Valley, specifically Kemet, specifically black Africans producing the world's first mass writing medium, papyrus. Not a symbol, not a rumor, a factory-level innovation. Papyrus wasn't accidental. It was engineered, strips cut with precision, layered crosswise for strength, pressed, dried, smooth, standardized. This wasn't art, this was industry. And here's where the lie gets uncomfortable. Papyrus functioned as paper in every meaningful way centuries before Europe had anything close. It carried contracts, diplomacy, scientific formulas, religious doctrine, medical instructions that modern doctors still reference. Africa didn't just write, Africa archived. Now pause and ask yourself something simple. If Africa was primitive, why did the ancient world depend on African paper to run its empires? Because they did. Greek philosophers didn't write on imagination. They wrote on papyrus imported from Africa. Roman administrators didn't govern on stone tablets. They governed on African paper. The Bible you've seen rewritten, retranslated, and recolored originally circulated on African papyrus. Europe didn't invent paper culture. They inherited it. And inheritance is quiet. Invention is loud. That's why the credit disappeared. Now here comes the part they really don't like discussing. Papyrus wasn't just a material, it was a gatekeeper. Whoever controlled papyrus controlled information, education, history, trade routes, memory itself, and Africa controlled it for centuries. That's why the ancient world came to Africa to learn, not the other way around. This is why Greek scholars studied in Egypt, why Roman elites paid African scribes, why libraries were built around African writing materials. And yet, when modern history books tell the story, Africa suddenly goes quiet. No credit, no invention, no authorship, just raw material. They reduce papyrus to a plant, a reed, something nature did by accident. But paper isn't a plant. Paper is process, and process means intellect. Europe didn't develop true paper until China's methods traveled west centuries later. That's the uncomfortable timeline. So when Europe claims paper as a pillar of its civilization, it's standing on African scaffolding it refuses to name. Now let's raise the tension, because papyrus wasn't the only African writing innovation. Leather parchment, perfected in Africa. Ink chemistry, African formulas. Binding techniques, African systems. Africa didn't just invent paper-like media. Africa invented the entire ecosystem around documentation, which means something darker comes into focus. If Africa owned writing, and writing controls narrative, why does Africa appear voiceless in the modern story? That wasn't an accident. That was removal. Libraries burned, records seized, texts reattributed. Origins blurred until Europe could step into the role of creator instead of continuator. This is why they pushed the idea that paper equals modernity, and modernity equals Europe. Break that equation, and the hierarchy falls apart, because once you admit Africa invented paper systems, you have to admit Africa engineered bureaucracy, education, and state power before Europe could spell its own history. And that leads to a question they never want asked out loud. If Africa invented the medium that preserves civilization, who decided Africa shouldn't be remembered as its author? Here's where the story tightens. Papyrus didn't just exist, it moved. It traveled through ports, caravans, and ships long before Europe had domestic alternatives, which means African paper wasn't local, it was global. And global control changes everything, because once papyrus left Africa, it became the bloodstream of ancient power. Empires don't rise on swords alone. They rise on paperwork, taxes, census records, military orders, land ownership, trade contracts. Every one of those ran on African-made writing surfaces. Rome didn't conquer the Mediterranean with stone tablets. They conquered it with administration. And administration runs on paper. This is the part history skips over quietly. Rome never produced papyrus. They imported it from Africa. That dependency matters, because dependency exposes hierarchy. The so-called classical world, Greece and Rome, functioned on African infrastructure, intellectual and material. When you hear about Plato, Aristotle, Hippocrates, their ideas weren't floating in the air. They were written down, copied, circulated on African paper. That means Africa didn't just supply raw goods. Africa supplied memory, and whoever supplies memory decides what survives. Now watch how the switch happens. When the Roman Empire expands, demand for papyrus explodes. Libraries multiply. Bureaucracy thickens. Education spreads. And Africa is right there at the center of it, until it becomes inconvenient. Because once Europe realizes paper equals power, dependence becomes a problem, not economically, psychologically. You can't claim supremacy while importing the very surface your supremacy is written on. So the narrative had to change. Papyrus becomes primitive, pre-paper, a stepping stone. That language is intentional, because if papyrus is framed as incomplete, Europe gets to frame itself as the finisher, the improver, the rightful heir. But here's the truth they avoid. Papyrus worked so well that Europe relied on it for over 1,000 years. If it was primitive, why did empires collapse when papyrus supply was disrupted? That happened. When trade routes fractured and African papyrus became harder to access, Europe didn't suddenly innovate. They stalled, records degraded, libraries shrank, administration weakened. That's not progress. That's dependence exposed. And it leads straight into what they call the Dark Ages. Funny how that darkness lines up perfectly with the loss of African systems. Now let's get sharper. China develops paper independently, yes, but Europe doesn't get that knowledge directly. It travels through Africa and the Islamic world first, North Africa, the Moors, scholars who already understood writing culture because Africa never stopped recording. Paper mills appear in places Europe still pretends were peripheral. Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Al-Andalus, not Paris, not London, not Rome. So when Europeans finally start producing their own paper, it is an invention. It's transfer, transferred knowledge, transferred methods, transferred expertise, and transfer doesn't get statues. Here's where the psychology kicks in. Europe needed a clean origin story, something untainted by African authorship. So papyrus is dismissed as not real paper. African parchment is sidelined. Ink chemistry is reframed as trial and error tinkering. Meanwhile, European paper suddenly becomes revolutionary, even though it appears centuries later. That's not historical honesty. That's branding. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Africa lacked civilization, why did every expanding empire rush to African centers of learning? Alexandria wasn't famous because of Greek genius. It was famous because it sat on African systems of documentation and archiving. That library wasn't stacked with stone. It was stacked with African paper. And when that knowledge threatened control, it burned, literally. Burning libraries isn't about destroying books. It's about destroying receipts. Receipts that show who built what first. Once the receipts are gone, stories become flexible. Attribution becomes negotiable. That's how Africa goes from inventor to footnote. And here's the real twist. Modern Europe doesn't deny papyrus existed. They just deny it counts. They redefine paper so Africa can't qualify. Then they teach the definition as truth. That's power, not the power to invent, the power to define. And once definitions are controlled, history obeys. So the question stops being, did Africa invent paper? That's already answered. The real question is darker. If Europe had to redefine paper to erase Africa, what else did they redefine to erase the people who wrote first? Now let's strip the romance away, because invention isn't about who touched it first. It's about who made it usable at scale, and Africa did that. Papyrus wasn't rare. It wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't reserved for elites alone. It was standardized. Same size, same texture, same durability. That matters. Standardization is the fingerprint of an advanced system. You don't standardize unless you're training scribes, enforcing rules, and moving information across distance. Africa wasn't experimenting. Africa was operating, which means writing wasn't decoration. It was governance, court rulings, census data, engineering plans, medical prescriptions. That requires literacy infrastructure, schools, curriculum, professional scribes. Africa had all of it. And this is where the lie gets sneaky. Modern textbooks separate writing from paper like they evolved independently. They didn't. Writing explodes only when the surface becomes affordable, portable, and reproducible. Africa solved that equation. Stone was heavy, clay was slow, animal skins were expensive. Papyrus changed the game, lightweight, flexible, fast to produce. That's why bureaucracy followed it everywhere. Now look at Europe during this same period. Fragmented, local, oral. That's not an insult. That's documented reality. Europe didn't lack intelligence, it lacked systems, and systems require recording. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot run an empire orally. Africa understood that early. That's why African states didn't just survive. They expanded, coordinated, and endured. And this brings us to the pivot nobody talks about. Because when Europe finally catches up, it doesn't credit Africa. It reframes Africa as a stepping stone. Necessary but inferior. Why? Because admitting Africa built the infrastructure of literacy forces a collapse of racial hierarchy. You can't claim intellectual superiority over the people who designed the tools your knowledge depends on. So the story bends. Papyrus becomes organic, natural, almost accidental. European paper becomes engineered, scientific, modern. But process doesn't care about race. Process cares about function. And functionally, papyrus did everything paper needed to do, which leads to a deeper problem. If Africa mastered documentation, record keeping, and information flow, then Africa mastered power long before Europe. That destroys the myth of African chaos. And myths are fragile. That's why Africa's writing systems are always minimized. Hieroglyphs are framed as pictures, not language. Meroitic is labeled undeciphered, then ignored. Ethiopic scripts are sidelined as religious curiosities, anything to avoid the obvious. Africa wrote, Africa recorded, Africa remembered. Now let's talk about loss, because this isn't just about invention, it's about interruption. Africa's documentation systems didn't disappear naturally, they were disrupted. Trade routes collapsed, libraries were targeted, knowledge centers were dismantled. And when documentation is disrupted, continuity breaks. Europe benefits from that break, because once Africa's written record fragments, Europe gets to define the timeline. Who's ancient, who's modern, who's advanced. That's why African paper becomes early and European paper becomes real. It's not chronological, it's political. Now watch how this affects the modern mind. If Africa didn't invent paper, then Africa didn't invent administration. If Africa didn't invent administration, then Africa didn't build states. If Africa didn't build states, then Africa needed guidance. That's the chain. Break the first link, and the whole justification collapses. That's why this topic is never taught straight, because once you accept that Africa engineered writing surfaces at scale, you have to accept something heavier. Africa built the blueprint for modern civilization, and Europe followed it. That's not opinion, that's sequence. So when you hear someone say, paper changed the world, ask the real question. Who changed paper into power first? And if Africa did, why does the world still pretend Africa was silent when history was being written? Now let's talk definitions, because this is where the trick really happens. Europe didn't erase Africa by force first. They erased Africa with language. Ask a simple question in a modern classroom. What is paper? You'll hear something like this. Paper is made from pulp. Paper comes from trees. Paper was invented in Europe. Notice what just happened. The definition was narrowed, not expanded, not clarified, restricted. And once you restrict the definition, you decide who qualifies. Papyrus suddenly doesn't count. Leather parchment doesn't count. African writing media becomes pre-paper. Not because it failed, but because it doesn't fit the story Europe wants to tell. That's not science. That's gatekeeping. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Paper is not trees. Paper is a concept, a manufactured surface designed to receive, preserve, and transmit information efficiently. Africa solved that concept early. Europe solved a variation later, but instead of saying later, Europe said better. And instead of saying different, they said first. That's the pivot. Once Europe industrialized paper production, they rewrote the definition to match their method. Wood pulp becomes the standard. Anything else becomes not quite. And suddenly, Africa's centuries of documentation fall outside the fence. Not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well. Now let's zoom in on power. When European states consolidated, paper became law, literally. Guilds controlled production. Kings controlled licensing. Churches controlled copying. Paper wasn't just material, it was authority. Whoever controlled paper controlled legitimacy. Birth records, land deeds, marriage certificates, legal contracts. If it wasn't written on approved paper, it didn't exist. So imagine what that means for African records. Once Europe dominates global power, African documentation becomes unofficial by default. Not wrong, not false, just invalid. That's how erasure works without burning a single page, and it gets colder. European historians later look back and say, Africa had no written history, not because Africa didn't write, but because Africa didn't write on European-approved paper. That's the scam. Africa wrote on papyrus, on parchment, on materials Europe later decided didn't count, so Africa gets recast as oral. Not because Africa lacked writing, but because Europe controlled the filing cabinet. Now let's talk money. Paper wasn't just knowledge, it was profit. Once Europe scaled paper production, it fueled publishing. Books, pamphlets, newspapers. Information became a commodity. And commodities need origin stories that flatter the seller. You don't sell European enlightenment by admitting African foundations. So the story cleans itself. Paper becomes European. Literacy becomes European. Modernity becomes European. Africa becomes background noise. Now pause and feel the weight of this. If Africa is removed from the story of paper, Africa is removed from the story of memory. And if Africa is removed from memory, Africa becomes available for rewriting. That's not accidental. That's strategic. Now here's the part that should bother you. Even today, historians admit papyrus functioned like paper. They admit it was used for everything paper is used for, but they still won't call it paper. Why? Because once they do, the timeline flips. Africa becomes the starting point. Europe becomes the adapter. And that threatens a lot more than textbooks. It threatens identity. It threatens the story Europe tells itself about progress, genius, and destiny. So instead, Africa is praised politely, then sidelined. Impressive for its time. Advanced but limited. Influential but outdated. Those phrases aren't neutral. They're fences. They keep Africa in the past while Europe claims the future. But here's the reality. There is no modern paper culture without African precedent. No libraries, no bureaucracy, no mass education. Europe didn't invent the idea of recording the world. They inherited it, and inheritance doesn't come with applause. Now ask yourself something sharp. If Africa's paper didn't count because Europe later changed the rules, how many other African inventions were disqualified after the fact? And who gets to decide what counts as invention in the first place? Now let's deal with the quiet lie. The lie that Africa stopped innovating, because that's what they imply when they say papyrus was early and European paper was advanced. as if Africa peaked, then froze, as if African knowledge stood still while Europe moved forward. That never happened. Africa didn't abandon writing technology. Africa refined it. Across the continent, different regions adapted writing surfaces to climate, purpose, and scale. In the Nile Valley, papyrus dominated because the environment supported it. In the Horn of Africa, parchment flourished. In North Africa, hybrid systems emerged that blended plant fibers, skins, and binding techniques. That's not stagnation, that's optimization. Innovation doesn't always look like replacement. Sometimes it looks like mastery. And Africa mastered documentation long before Europe standardized anything. Now let's talk about Ethiopia, because Ethiopia ruins the narrative. Ethiopia maintained continuous written tradition for over 1,000 years, not borrowed, not intermittent, unbroken, text copied, archives preserved, legal codes recorded on parchment. This wasn't folklore, this was statecraft. And here's the part that gets ignored. When Europe lost access to African systems and entered periods of fragmentation, Ethiopia did not. No dark age, no collapse of literacy. Which tells you something important. Africa didn't lose writing because it was incapable. Africa lost writing visibility because Europe lost control of Africa. And once Europe regained control, the story was rewritten. Now watch the trick repeat. European scholars later encounter African manuscripts. Instead of saying Africa developed advanced documentation, they say Africa preserved. Preserved implies passive, like Africa was a museum, not a laboratory, but preservation requires systems, training, standards, intent. Africa wasn't holding on to scraps. Africa was maintaining civilizations. Now let's widen the lens. Across the Sahel, empires like Mali and Songhai ran complex bureaucracies, taxes, trade, education. You don't run transcontinental trade networks orally. You document weights, measures, contracts, paper matters, and guess what they used? Imported paper from North Africa, paper produced in African-controlled mills, paper circulating through Islamic scholarly networks rooted in African knowledge systems. Again, not Europe, which means something else becomes clear. Africa wasn't waiting for Europe to teach it paper. Africa was teaching the world how to manage knowledge at scale. Now here comes the fall. When European colonial expansion accelerates, African documentation becomes a threat, because written records mean land ownership, written contracts mean sovereignty, written history means legitimacy. So those records are dismissed, destroyed, or absorbed. African texts are labeled religious, or local, or non-scientific, anything to strip them of authority, because authority lives on paper, and paper, once again, becomes the battlefield. Europe doesn't just take land, it takes archives. It refiles African history under European categories, and once it's filed, it's controlled. Now ask yourself something simple. Why does Europe obsess over who invented paper, but rarely talk about who controlled writing systems continuously? Because invention is a moment. Continuity is power. Africa had continuity. Europe had interruption. That's the reversal. Now, here's the twist. Even modern paper owes a debt to African methods, sizing techniques, ink absorption control, binding logic. These didn't appear magically in Europe. They were adapted from existing systems encountered through Africa and the Islamic world. So when Europe claims paper as its own, it's claiming a remix built on African foundations. And remixes don't exist without originals. So the narrative that Africa invented paper early and Europe perfected it later is incomplete. Africa didn't hand off a crude prototype. Africa handed off a functioning system. Europe scaled it differently. That's it. And scaling doesn't erase origin. Now sit with this. If Africa never stopped writing, if Africa never stopped documenting, if Africa never stopped archiving, then Africa was never silent. It was muted. So the real question isn't why Africa didn't innovate further. The real question is this: why does the world only recognize innovation when Europe does it? Now let's talk about who benefits from forgetting, because this isn't just an academic disagreement. This is about power structures that still exist right now. When you erase Africa's role in inventing paper systems, you don't just steal credit, you steal authority. Authority over history, authority over knowledge, authority over who gets to be seen as a thinker. Paper decides whose ideas get preserved and whose get dismissed. That's why this matters. If Africa invented and controlled early writing surfaces, then Africa controlled early narrative. And narrative is dangerous. Narrative shapes identity. Identity shapes confidence. Confidence shapes resistance. So Africa's authorship had to be neutralized. And the easiest way to neutralize authorship is to say, that doesn't count. Not wrong, not fake, just irrelevant. Now watch how that logic spreads. Once African paper is framed as not real paper, African writing becomes not real history. And once African history is not real, African people become without contribution. That's not accidental language, that's ideological engineering. It creates a mental hierarchy where Europe invents, Africa imitates, and the rest of the world waits. And here's the thing nobody says out loud. This hierarchy didn't form because Europe invented more. It formed because Europe archived more. After taking control of archiving systems, that's the flip. Control the archive, control the past. Now let's zoom into education. Modern schooling teaches paper as a European milestone, printing press, books, newspapers. But it never asks the obvious question. What were they printing on before Europe invented paper? The answer breaks the lesson plan. African writing surfaces, papyrus, parchment, imported paper from Africa and the Islamic world, which means Europe's so-called intellectual explosion didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened on borrowed infrastructure. And borrowing isn't shameful, erasing is. Now feel this shift. Once Europe mass produces paper, literacy expands, for some. But access to literacy isn't equal. Paper becomes cheap in Europe, expensive elsewhere. Suddenly Europe produces more books, more records, more evidence. And evidence shapes historical judgment. So Europe appears more documented. Africa appears less. Not because Africa didn't write, but because Europe now controls volume and distribution. Quantity becomes confused with originality, and that confusion sticks. Now here's where the story hits modern times. When people say Africa didn't invent much, they're repeating an archive bias. They're mistaking preserved European paper for absence of African thought. They're confusing storage location with origin. And that's dangerous because it trains the mind to trust what survived under European control and doubt everything else. That's not neutral education, that's conditioning. Now ask yourself this. If Africa invented early paper systems, if Africa maintained continuous written traditions, if Africa taught the ancient world how to document power, why is Africa still framed as developing? Because development isn't measured by capability, it's measured by recognition. And recognition follows power. Europe didn't just take land, it took narrative control. It decided which inventions get named, dated, and celebrated. And paper is the perfect example, because paper decides who gets remembered. Now here's the quiet irony. Every modern claim about Africa's lack of innovation is written on a medium Africa helped invent. Let that sit. Every dismissal, every insult, every textbook paragraph, all written on paper. Paper that exists because Africa solved the problem first. That's not poetic, that's historical irony. And irony has a way of revealing truth. Now let's sharpen the blade. If Africa invented paper systems, then Africa invented the conditions for science. Observation, recording, replication. No paper, no science. No documentation, no progress. So the idea that Africa contributed culture but not science collapses. Culture without documentation doesn't scale. Africa scaled, which means Africa wasn't just creative. Africa was analytical, and that terrifies fragile hierarchies, because once you accept that Africa invented the tools of memory, you have to ask a final question. If Africa controlled the earliest archives, what histories were written before Europe learned how to read them? Now let's confront the last defense, the one people fall back on when everything else collapses. Well, Even if Africa did it first, it didn't matter in the long run. That's the escape hatch. And it's false. Because paper doesn't just preserve the past, paper shapes the future. Whoever defines how knowledge is, recorded decides how power moves forward. Africa didn't just invent early paper systems. Africa established the logic of documentation that modern systems still follow. Indexes, margins, columns, sequential record keeping. These weren't decorative choices. They were solutions to scale. How do you manage large populations? How do you track resources across distance? How do you standardize law? You write it down. Africa solved those problems first. Now look at modern bureaucracy, passports, IDs, property deeds, academic transcripts, all descendants of early African documentation logic, which means Africa didn't just invent a medium. Africa invented governance technology. That's the part people aren't ready for, because once you accept that, you can't keep pretending Africa was waiting to be civilized. Africa was civilizing. Now here's the psychological twist. Europe didn't just inherit African systems. Europe weaponized them. Paper became a tool of control, borders drawn on maps, ownership defined by documents, identity reduced to certificates. Those tools were neutral at first, but neutrality disappears when power concentrates. And when Europe used paper to dominate, it never wanted to admit where the tool came from, because you don't credit the architect while living in a stolen house. So Africa's role fades further, not erased completely, just blurred enough. Now let's hit the irony again. African societies that relied on oral tradition are often mocked, but oral systems existed alongside writing, not instead of it. Oral memory was redundancy, backup. Africa understood something Europe forgot. Paper can be destroyed, memory can't. So Africa layered systems, written records for administration, oral transmission for culture. That's not backward, that's resilient. And resilience doesn't fit the primitive narrative, so it's ignored. Now think about this. When Europe burns African archives, knowledge doesn't vanish entirely. Fragments survive orally. But later historians dismiss oral accounts as unreliable. Why? Because they privilege paper. Paper Europe controls. That's circular power. Destroy the paper, dismiss the memory, then claim absence. That's not history. That's laundering. Now bring it back to today. Why does this matter to someone watching right now? Because identity is built on legacy. If you believe your ancestors didn't invent, didn't document, didn't build systems, you lower your expectations of yourself. That's not accidental. Historical erasure has psychological consequences. Confidence gaps don't appear out of nowhere. They're taught. And paper plays a role. Who gets textbooks? Who gets credited? Who gets footnotes? Africa is always referenced, rarely centered. Now here's the final pressure point. Africa invented paper systems not because it wanted recognition, but because civilization required it. Europe didn't reject that system because it was flawed, but because it was African. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The story of paper isn't about trees or pulp. It's about who gets to define civilization. Africa solved the problem of memory early. Europe took control of memory later, and control changed the story. So the question that hangs now isn't historical, it's personal. If Africa helped invent the very tool that preserves truth, why are so many truths about Africa still missing from the page? So let's end this where it actually lands. Not in ancient Egypt, not in Rome, not in Europe's libraries. Right now, with you. Because this story was never just about paper. It was about permission. Permission to be seen as a thinker. Permission to be seen as a builder. Permission to be seen as the source. Once Africa is removed from the invention of paper systems, something subtle happens. Africa is removed from authorship, and authorship is power. If you didn't write it, you didn't design it. If you didn't design it, you didn't lead. If you didn't lead, you must have followed. That's the mental trap. And paper is the quietest trap of all because it feels neutral. Trees, ink, pages. But nothing about paper is neutral. Paper decides whose voice survives. Africa invented early paper systems because Africa needed memory. Complex societies demand records. That's not up for debate. What is up for debate? apparently, is whether Africa deserves credit, and credit changes everything. Because once Africa is credited, the myth of European intellectual supremacy cracks. Not collapses dramatically, cracks slowly, enough for light to get in. Now let's talk about the final twist. Europe didn't become powerful because it invented paper. Europe became powerful because it controlled paper at scale. Those are two very different things. Control came later, invention came earlier. Africa handled invention. Europe handled monopolization. And monopolies rewrite history to protect themselves. That's why this story feels uncomfortable to some people. It's not threatening because it's false. It's threatening because it's accurate. If Africa invented the tools of memory, then Africa shaped the earliest rules of civilization, which means Africa isn't outside the story of modernity. Africa is underneath it, foundational. And foundations are never celebrated. They're buried, covered, built over, claimed by whoever owns the building now. But ownership doesn't erase origin. Now here's the part that should stick with you. Every time someone dismisses Africa's contributions, they're doing it on paper. Every time someone says Africa didn't invent much, that sentence exists because Africa solved the problem of writing it down. That contradiction matters because contradictions reveal lies. And once lies are exposed, they lose their grip. This isn't about rewriting history to feel good. It's about correcting history so it can function honestly. Paper wasn't Europe's miracle. It was Africa's necessity. Europe refined production. Africa defined the purpose. That's the distinction they never want to make, because purpose implies vision, and vision implies leadership. Now ask yourself something final. If Africa invented the systems that preserve truth, and those systems were later used to erase Africa's role, what does that tell you about how history is written today? And more importantly, what else are you reading, believing, and accepting? That was filtered through paper controlled by someone who didn't want you to know who wrote first.